The Royal Institute of International Affairs (RIIA) is nothing but the Milner Group writ large. It was funded by the group, has been consistently controlled by the group, and to this day is the Milner Group in its widest aspect. It is the legitimate child of the Round Table organization, just as the latter was the legitimate child of the Closer Union movement organized in South Africa in 1907. All three of these organizations were formed by the same small group of persons. All three received their initial financial backing from Sir Abe Bailey, and all three used the same methods for working out and propagating their ideas, the so-called Round Table method of discussion groups plus a journal. This similarity is not an accident. The new organization was intended to be a wider aspect of the Milner Group, the plan being to influence the leaders of thought through the Round Table and to influence a wider group through the RIIA. The real funder of the institute was Lionel Curtis, although this fact was concealed for many years and he was presented to the public as merely one among a number of funders. In more recent years, however, the fact that Curtis was the real funder of the Institute has been publicly stated by members of the Institute and by the Institute itself on many occasions, and never denied. One example will suffice. In the annual report of the Institute for 1942 to 1943 we read the following sentence: "When the Institute was founded through the inspiration of Mr. Lionel Curtis during the Peace Conference of Paris in 1919, those associated with him in laying the foundations were a group of comparatively young men and women." The Institute was organized at a joint conference of British and American experts at the Hotel Majestic on May 30, 1919. At the suggestion of Lord Robert Cecil, the chair was given to General Tasker Bliss of the American delegation. We have already indicated that the experts of the British delegation at the Peace Conference were almost exclusively from the Milner Group and Cecil Block. The American group of experts, the inquiry, was manned almost as completely by persons from institutions including universities dominated by J.P. Morgan and Company. This was not an accident. Moreover, the Milner Group has always had very close relationships with the associates of J.P. Morgan and with the various branches of the Carnegie Trust. These relationships, which are merely examples of the closely knit ramifications of international financial capitalism, were probably based on the financial holdings controlled by the Milner Group through the Rhodes Trust. The term international financier can be applied with full justice to several members of the Milner Group inner circle, such as Brand, Hitchens, and above all, Milner himself. At the meeting at the Hotel Majestic, the British group included Lionel Curtis, Philip Kerr, Lord Robert Cecil, Lord Eustace Percy, Sir Eyre Crowe, Sir Cecil Hurst, J. W. Headlam Morley, Geoffrey Dawson, Harold Temperley, and G. M. Gawthorne Hardy. It was decided to found a permanent organization for the study of international affairs and to begin by writing a history of the Peace Conference. A committee was set up to supervise the writing of this work. It had Lord Neston as chairman, Lionel Curtis as secretary, and was financed by a gift of £2,000 from Thomas W. Lamont of J.P. Morgan and Company. This group picked Harold Temperley as editor of the work, that appeared in 6 large volumes in the years 1920 to 1924, under the auspices of the RIIA. The British organisation was set up by a committee of which Lord Robert Cecil was chairman. Lionel Curtis was honorary secretary and the following were members: Lord Eustace Percy, AAC later Sir John Billy, Philip Noel Baker, Clement Jones, Harold Temperley, A.L. Smith classmate of Meltner and master of Balliol George W. Prothero, and Geoffrey Dawson. This group drew up the Constitution and made a list of prospective members. Lionel Curtis and Grethorne Hardy drew up the bylaws. The above description is based on the official history of the RIIA published by the Institute itself in 1937 and written by Stephen King Hall. It does not agree in its details, committees and names with information from other sources, equally authoritative, such as the Journal of the Institute or the preface to Temperley's History of the Peace Conference. The latter, for example, says that the members were chosen by a committee consisting of Lord Robert Cecil, Sir Palatine Carroll, and Sir Cecil Hurst. As a matter of fact, all of these differing accounts are correct, for the Institute was formed in such an informal fashion, as among friends, that membership on committees and lines of authority between committees were not very important. As an example, Mr. King Hall says that he was invited to join the Institute in 1919 by Philip Kerr Lord Lothian, although this name is not to be found on any membership committee. At any rate, one thing is clear: the Institute was formed by the Cecil Block and the Milner Group, acting together, and the real decisions were being made by members of the latter. As organized, the Institute consisted of a council with a chairman and 2 honorary secretaries, and a small group of paid employees. Among these latter, A.J. Toynbee, nephew of Meltner's old friend at Balliol, was the most important. There were about 300 members in 1920, 714 in 1922, 1787 in 1929, and 2414 in 1936. There have been 3 chairmen of the council: Lord Meston in 1920 to 1926. Major General Sir Neil Malcolm in 1926 to 1935, and Lord Astor from 1935 to the present. All of these are members of the Milner Group, although General Malcolm is not yet familiar to us. General Malcolm, from Eton and Sandhurst, married the sister of Dougal Malcolm of Meltner's kindergarten in 1907, when he was a captain in the British Army. By 1916 he was a lieutenant colonel and 2 years later a major general. He was with the British military mission in Berlin in 1919 to 1921 and general officer commanding in Malaya in 1921 to 1924, retiring in 1924. He was High Commissioner for German Refugees, a project in which the Miltner Group was deeply involved in 1936 to 1938, and has been associated with a number of industrial and commercial firms, including the British North Borneo Company, of which he is president, and Dougal Malcolm is vice president. It must not be assumed that General Malcolm won advancement in the world because of his connections with the Miltner Group, for his older brother, Sir Ian Malcolm, was an important member of the Cecil bloc long before Sir Neil joined the Miltner Group. Sir Ian, who went to Eton and New College, was Assistant Private Secretary to Lord Salisbury in 1895 to 1900, was Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Chief Secretary for Ireland George Wyndham in 1901 to 1903, and was Private Secretary to Balfour in the United States in 1917 and at the Peace Conference in 1919. He wrote the sketch of Walter Long of the Cecil bloc, Lord Long of Wraxall, in the Dictionary of National Biography. From the beginning, the two honorary secretaries of the Institute were Lionel Curtis and G.M. Thornton. These two, especially the latter, did much of the active work of running the organization. In 1926, the report of the Council of the RIIA said, "It is not too much to say that the very existence of the Institute is due to those who have served as honorary officers." The burden of work was so great on Curtis and Thornton by 1926 that Sir Otto Bite, of the Rhodes Trust, Miltner Group, and British South Africa Company, gave £1,000 for 1926 and 1927 for secretarial assistance. F. B. Bourdillon assumed the task of providing this assistance in March 1926. He had been secretary to Feetham on the Irish Boundary Commission in 1924 to 1925 and a member of the British delegation to the Peace Conference in 1919. He has been in the research department of the Foreign Office since 1943. The active governing body of the Institute is the Council, originally called the Executive Committee. Under the more recent name, it generally had 25 to 30 members, of whom slightly less than half were usually of the Miltner Group. In 1923, 5 members were elected, including Lord Meston, Headlam Morley, and Mrs. Alfred Lyttelton. The following year, 7 were elected, including Wilson Harris, Philip Kerr, and Sir Neil Malcolm. And so it went. In 1936, at least 11 out of 26 members of the Council were of the Miltner Group. These included Lord Astor Chairman L. Curtis, G.M. Thornton, Lord Haley, H. D. Henderson, Stephen King Hall, Mrs. Alfred Lyttelton, Sir Neil Malcolm, Lord Meston, Sir Arthur Salter, J. W. Wheeler Bennett, E. L. Woodward, and Sir Alfred Zimmern. Among the others were A. V. Alexander, Sir John Power, Sir Norman Angell, Clement Jones, Lord Lytton, Harold Nicholson, Lord Snell, and C. K. Webster. Others who were on the Council at various times were E. H. Carr, Harold Butler, G. N. Clark, Geoffrey Crowther, H. V. Hodgson, Hugh Wyndham, G.W.A. Armsley Gort, Walter Layton, Austin Chamberlain, Malcolm MacDonald elected 1933, and many other members of the group. The chief activities of the RIIA were the holding of discussion meetings, the organization of study groups, the sponsoring of research, and the publication of information and materials based on these. At the first meeting, Sir Maurice Hankey read a paper on diplomacy by conference, showing how the League of Nations grew out of the imperial conferences. This was published in the Round Table. No complete record exists of the meetings before the fall of 1921, but, beginning then, the principal speech at each meeting and resumes of the comments from the floor were published in the journal. At the first of these recorded meetings, D.G. Hogarth spoke on the Arab States, with Lord Chelmsford in the chair. Stanley Reed, Carroll, and Meston spoke from the floor. 2 weeks later, H.A.L. Fisher spoke on the Second Assembly of the League of Nations, with Lord Robert Cecil in the chair. Temperley and Wilson Harris also spoke. In November, Philip Kerr was the chief figure for 2 evenings on Pacific problems as they would be submitted to the Washington Conference. At the end of the same month, A.J. Toynbee spoke on the Greco-Turkish question, with Sir Arthur Evans in the chair, and early in December his father-in-law, Gilbert Murray, spoke on self-determination, with Lord Sumner in the chair. In January 1922, Chaim Weizmann spoke on Zionism in February. Carroll spoke on Egypt in April. Walter T. Layton spoke on the financial achievement of the League of Nations, with Lord Robert Cecil in the chair. In June, Wilson Harris spoke on the Genoa Conference, with Robert H. Brand in the chair. In October, Ormsby Gore spoke on mandates, with Lord Lubbock in the chair. 2 weeks later, Sir Arthur Steele Maitland spoke on the League of Nations, with H.A.L. Fisher in the chair. In March 1923, Harold Butler spoke on the International Labour Office, with G.N. Barnes in the chair. 2 weeks later, Philip Kern spoke on the political situation in the United States, with Arthur Balfour in the chair. In October 1923, Edward F. Ellwood Lord Halifax spoke on the League of Nations, with H.A.L. Fisher in the chair. In November 1924, C.R. Peacock Parkin's protégé spoke on Mexico, with Lord Eustace Percy in the chair. In October 1925, Leopold Amory spoke on the League of Nations, with Robert Cecil as chairman, while in May 1926, H.A.L. Fisher spoke on the same subject, with Neil Malcolm as chairman. In November 1925, Paul Mantua spoke on the procedure of the League, with Brand as chairman. In June 1923, Edward Grieg spoke on Egypt, with D.G. Hogarth in the chair. In the season of 1933 to 1934, the speakers included Ormsby Gort, Oliver Lyttelton, Edward Grieg, Donald Somerville, Toynbee, Zimmern, R.W. Seaton, Watson, and Lord Lothian. In the season of 1938 to 1939, the list contains the names of Wilson Harris, C.A. McCartney, Toynbee, Lord Haley, A.G.B. Fisher, Harold Butler, Curtis, Lord Lothian, Zimmern, Lionel Hitchens, and Lord Halifax. These rather scattered observations will show how the meetings were peppered by members of the Miltner Group. This does not mean that the group monopolized the meetings, or even spoke at a majority of them. The meetings generally took place once a week from October to June of each year, and probably members of the group spoke or presided at no more than a quarter of them. This, however, represents far more than their due proportion, for when the Institute had 2,500 members, the Miltner Group amounted to no more than 100. The proceedings of the meetings were generally printed in abbreviated form in the Journal of the Institute. Until January 1927, this periodical was available only to members, but since that day it has been open to public subscription. The first issue was as anonymous as the first issue of the Round Table. No list of editors, no address, and no signature to the opening editorial introducing the new journal. The articles, however, had the names of the speakers indicated. When it went on public sale in January 1927, the name of the Institute was added to the cover. In time it took the name International Affairs. The first editor, we learn from a later issue, was Cawthorne Hardy. In January 1932 an editorial board was placed in charge of the publication. It consisted of Meston, Cawthorne Hardy, and Zimmern. This same board remained in control until war forced suspension of publication at the end of 1939, when publication was resumed in 1944 in Canada. The editorial board consisted of Hugh Wyndham, Geoffrey Crowther, and H.A.R. Gibb. Wyndham is still chairman of the board, but since the war the membership of the board has changed somewhat. In 1948 it had 6 members, of whom 3 are employees of the Institute. One is the son-in-law of an employee, the 5th is Professor of Arabic at Oxford, and the last is the chairman, Hugh Wyndham. In 1949 Adam Maris was added. In addition to the History of the Peace Conference and the journal International Affairs, the Institute publishes the annual Survey of International Affairs. This is written either by members of the group or by employees of the Institute. The chief writers have been Toynbee, his second wife, V.M. Boulter, Robert J. Stopford, who appears to be one of R. H. Brand's men and who wrote the reparations section each year, H. V. Hogson, who did the economic sections from 1930 to 1938, and A. G. B. Fisher, who has done the economic sections since Hogson. Until 1928 the survey had an appendix of documents, but since that year these have been published in a separate volume, usually edited by J. W. Wheeler Bennett. Mr. Wheeler Bennett became a member of the Miltner Group and the Institute by a process of amalgamation. In 1924 he had founded the Document Service, which he called Information Service on International Affairs. and in the years following 1924 he published a number of valuable digests of documents and other information on disarmament, security, the World Court, preparations, etc., as well as a periodical called the Bulletin of International News. In 1927 he became Honorary Information Secretary of the RIAA, and in 1930 the Institute bought out all his information services for £3,500 and made them into the Information Department of the Institute, still in charge of Mr. Wheeler Bennett. Since the annual documents on international affairs resumed publication in 1944, it has been in charge of Monica Curtis, who may be related to Lionel Curtis, while Mr. Wheeler Bennett has been busy elsewhere. In 1938 to 1939 he was visiting professor of international relations at the University of Virginia. In 1939 to 1944 he was in the United States in various propaganda positions with the British Library of Information and for 2 years as head of the British Political Warfare Mission in New York. Since 1946, he has been engaged in editing, from the British side, an edition of about 20 volumes of the captured documents of the German Foreign Ministry. He has also lectured on international affairs at New College, a connection obviously made through the Milner Group. The Survey of International Affairs has been financed since 1925 by an endowment of £20,000 given by Sir Daniel Stevenson for this purpose, and also to provide a research chair of international history at the University of London. Arnold J. Toynbee has held both the professorship and the editorship since their establishment. He has also been remunerated by other grants from the Institute. When the first major volume of the survey, covering the years 1920 to 1923, was published, a round-table discussion was held at Chatham House, November 17, 1925, to criticize it. Headlam Morley was chairman, and the chief speakers were Curtis, Wyndham, Gurthorne Hardy, Gilbert Murray, and Toynbee himself. Since the survey did not cover British Commonwealth affairs, except in a general fashion, a project was established for a parallel survey of British Commonwealth relations. This was financed by a grant of money from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The task was entrusted to W. K. Hancock, a member of All Souls since 1924 and Chuck Shelley Professor of Economic History residing at All Souls since 1944. He produced 3 substantial volumes of the survey in 1940–1942, with a supplementary legal chapter in Volume I by R.T. Latham of All Souls and the Milner Group. The establishment of the Stevenson Chair of International History at London, controlled by the RIAA, gave the crew the idea of establishing similar endowed chairs in other subjects and in other places. In 1936, Sir Henry Price gave £20,000 to endow for 7 years a chair of international economics at Chatham House. This was filled by Alan G. B. Fisher of Australia. In 1947 another chair was established at Chatham House, the Abe Daly Professorship of Commonwealth Relations. This was filled by Nicholas Mansart, who had previously written a few articles on Irish affairs and has since published a small volume on Commonwealth affairs. By the terms of the foundation, the Institute had a voice in the election of professors to the Wilson Chair of International Politics at the University College of Wales, Aberystwyth. As a result, this chair has been occupied by close associates of the group from its foundation. The following list of incumbents is significant. A. Easmern, 1919–1921. C. K. Webster, 1922–1932. J. D. Green, 1932–1934. J. F. B. Reyna, acting 1934–1936. E. H. Carr, 1936 to now. 3 of these names are familiar. Of the others, Henry V. Reyna was secretary to the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, to be discussed in a moment. Jerome Green was an international banker close to the Milner Group. Originally Mr. Green had been a close associate of J. D. Rockefeller, but in 1917 he shifted to the international banking firm Higgins and Company of Boston. In 1918 he was American Secretary to the Allied Maritime Transport Council in London, of which Arthur Salter was General Secretary. He became a resident of Toynbee Hall and established a relationship with the Milner Group. In 1919 he was secretary to the Reparations Commission of the Peace Conference, a post in which his successor was Arthur Salter in 1920–1922. He was chairman of the Pacific Council of the Institute of Pacific Relations in 1929–1932. This last point will be discussed in a moment. Mr. Green was a trustee and secretary of the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913–1917, and was a trustee of the Rockefeller Institute and of the Rockefeller General Education Board in 1912–1939. The study groups of the RIIA are direct descendants of the Round Table meetings of the Round Table Group. They have been defined by Stephen King Hall as unofficial royal commissions charged by the Council of Chatham House with the investigation of specific problems. These study groups are generally made up of persons who are not members of the Milner Group, and their reports are frequently published by the Institute. In 1932 the Rockefeller Foundation gave the Institute a grant of £8,000 a year for 5 years to advance the study group method of research. This was extended for 5 years more in 1937. In 1923, Lionel Curtis got a Canadian, Colonel R. W. Leonard, so interested in the work of the Institute that he bought Lord Kinnair's house at 10 St. James Square as a home for the Institute. Since William Pitt had once lived in the building, it was named Chatham House, a designation which is now generally applied to the Institute itself. The only condition of the grant was that the Institute should raise an endowment to yield at least £10,000 a year for upkeep. Since the building had no adequate assembly hall, Sir John Power, the honorary treasurer, gave £10,000 to build one on the rear. The building itself was renovated and furnished under the care of Mrs. Alfred Lyttelton, who, like her late husband but unlike her son, Oliver, was a member of the Milner Group. The assumption of the title to Chatham House brought up a major crisis within the Institute when a group led by Professor J. F. Pollard, Fellow of All Souls but not a member of the Milner Group, opposed the acceptance of the gift because of the financial commitment involved. Curtis put on an organized drive to mobilize the group and put the opposition to flight. The episode is mentioned in a letter from John Dove to Brand, dated October 9, 1923. This episode opens up the whole question of the financial resources available to the Institute and to the Milner Group in general. Unfortunately, we cannot examine the subject here, but it should be obvious that a group with such connections as the Milner Group would not find it difficult to finance the RIIA. In general, the funds came from the various endowments, banks, and industrial concerns with which the Milner Group had relationships. The original money in 1919, only £200, came from Abe Bailey. In later years he added to this, and in 1928 gave £5,000 a year in perpetuity on the condition that the Institute never accept members who were not British subjects. When Sir Abe died in 1940, the annual report of the Council said, "With the passing of Sir Bailey the Council and all the members of Chatham House mourn the loss of their most munificent founder." Sir Abe had paid various other expenses during the years. For example, when the Institute in November 1935 gave a dinner to General Smuts, Sir Abe paid the cost. All of this was done as a disciple of Lord Milner, for whose principles of imperial policy Bailey always had complete devotion. Among the other benefactors of the Institute, we might mention the following. In 1926 the Carnegie United Kingdom trustees Hitchens and Dame Janet Courtney gave £3,000 for books. The Bank of England gave £600. J. D. Rockefeller gave £3,000. In 1929 pledges were obtained from about a score of important banks and corporations, promising annual grants to the Institute. Most of these had one or more members of the Milner Group on their boards of directors. Included in the group were the Anglo-American Oil Company, the Bank of England, Barclays Bank, Baring Brothers, the British American Tobacco Company, the British South Africa Company, Central Mining and Investment Corporation, Erlangers Limited, the Ford Motor Company, Hambros Bank, Imperial Chemical Industries, Lazard Brothers, Lever Brothers, Lloyd's Bank, the Mercantile and General Insurance Company, the Midland Bank, Reuters, Rothschild and Sons, Stern Brothers, Vickers Armstrong, the Westminster Bank, and Whitehall Securities Corporation. Since 1939 the chief benefactors of the Institute have been the Astor family and Sir Henry Price. In 1942 the latter gave £50,000 to buy the house next door to Chatham House for an expansion of the library of which E. L. Woodward was supervisor. In the same year Lord Astor, who had been giving £2,000 a year since 1937, promised £3,000 a year for 7 years to form a Lord Lothian Memorial Fund to promote good relations between the United States and Britain. At the same time, each of Lord Astor's 4 sons promised £1,000 a year for 7 years to the general fund of the Institute. Chatham House had close institutional relations with a number of other similar organizations, especially in the Dominions. It also has a parallel organization, which was regarded as a branch, in New York. This latter, the Council on Foreign Relations, was not funded by the American group that attended the meeting at the Hotel Majestic in 1919, but was taken over almost entirely by that group immediately after its funding in 1919. This group was made up of the experts on the American delegation to the peace conference who were most closely associated with J.P. Morgan and Company. The Morgan Bank has never made any real effort to conceal its position in regard to the Council on Foreign Relations. The list of officers and board of directors are printed in every issue of Foreign Affairs and have always been loaded with partners, associates, and employees of J.P. Morgan and Company. According to Stephen King Hall, the RIIA agreed to regard the Council on Foreign Relations as its American branch. The relationship between the two has always been very close. For example, the publications of one are available at reduced prices to the members of the other. They frequently sent gifts of books to each other. The Council, for example, giving the Institute a 75-volume set of the Foreign Relations of the United States in 1933, and there is considerable personal contact between the officers of the two. Toynbee, for example, left a manuscript of volumes 7 to 9 of a study of history in the Council's vault during the recent war. Chatham House established branch institutes in the various dominions, but it was a slow process. In each case, the Dominion Institute was formed about a core consisting of the Round Table Group's members in that dominion. The earliest were set up in Canada and Australia in 1927. The problem was discussed in 1933 at the first unofficial British Commonwealth Relations Conference, Toronto, and the decision made to extend the system to New Zealand, South Africa, India, and Newfoundland. The last name was established by Zimmer on a visit there the same year. The others were set up in 1934. 1936. As we have said, the members of the Dominion Institutes of International Affairs were the members of the Milner Group and their close associates. In Canada, for example, Robert L. Borden was the first president 1927 to 1931, and W. Rowell was the second president. Sir Joseph Flavel and Vincent Massey were vice presidents. Glazebrook was honorary secretary, and Percy Corbett was one of the most important members. Of these, the first 3 were close associates of the Milner Group, especially of Brand in the period of the First World War. The last 4 were members of the group itself. When the Indian Institute was set up in 1936, it was done at the Viceroy's house at a meeting convened by Lord Willingdon Brand's cousin. Robert Cecil sent a message, which was read by Stephen King Hall. Sir Maurice G.W. of All Souls became a member of the council. In South Africa, B.K. Long of the kindergarten was one of the most important members. In the Australian Institute, Sir Thomas Bavint was president in 1934 to 1941, while F. W. Eggleston was one of its principal founders and vice president for many years. In New Zealand, W. Downey Stewart was president of the Institute of International Affairs from 1935 on. Naturally, the Miltner Group did not monopolize the membership or the official positions in these new institutes any more than they did in London, for this would have weakened the chief aim of the group in setting them up, namely to extend their influence to wider areas. Closely associated with the various institutes of international affairs were the various branches of the Institute of Pacific Relations. This was originally founded at Atlantic City in September 1924 as a private organization to study the problems of the Pacific Basin. It has representatives from 8 countries with interests in the area. The representatives from the United Kingdom and the 3 British Dominions were closely associated with the Miltner Group. Originally each country had its national unit, but by 1939, in the 4 British areas, the local Institute of Pacific Relations had merged with the local Institute of International Affairs. Even before this, the 2 institutes in each country had practically interchangeable officers, dominated by the Miltner Group. In the United States, the Institute of Pacific Relations never merged with the Council on Foreign Relations, but the influence of the associates of J.P. Morgan and other international bankers remained strong on both. The chief figure in the Institute of Pacific Relations of the United States was, for many years, Jerome D. Green, Boston banker close to both Rockefeller and Morgan and for many years secretary at Harvard University. The Institutes of Pacific Relations held joint meetings, similar to those of the unofficial conferences on British Commonwealth relations and with a similar group of delegates from the British member organizations. These meetings met every 2 years at first, beginning at Honolulu in 1925 and then assembling at Honolulu again 1927, at Kyoto 1929, at Shanghai 1931, at Banff 1933 and at Yosemite Park 1936. F. W. Eggleston, of Australia and the Miltner Group, presided over most of the early meetings. Between meetings, the central organization, set up in 1927, was the Pacific Council, a self-perpetuating body. In 1930, at least 5 of its 7 members were from the Miltner Group, as can be seen from the following list. The Pacific Council, 1930. Jerome D. Green of the United States, F. W. Eggleston of Australia and W. Rao of Canada, D. Z. T. Ue of China, Lionel Curtis of the United Kingdom, Naito of Japan, Sir James Allen of New Zealand. The close relationships among all these organizations can be seen from a tour of inspection which Lionel Curtis and Ivan S. McAdam, Secretary of Chatham House, in succession to F. B. Bourdillon, since 1929, made in 1938. They not only visited the Institutes of International Affairs of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada but attended the Princeton meeting of the Pacific Council of the IPR. Then they separated, Curtis going to New York to address the dinner of the Council on Foreign Relations and visit the Carnegie Foundation, while McAdam went to Washington to visit the Carnegie Endowment and the Brookings Institution. Through the League of Nations, where the influence of the Milner Group was very great, the RIIA was able to extend its intellectual influence into countries outside the Commonwealth. This was done, for example, through the Intellectual Cooperation Organization of the League of Nations. This organization consisted of two chief parts: A. The International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, an advisory body, and B. The International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, an executive organ of the committee, with headquarters in Paris. The International Committee had about 20 members from various countries. Gilbert Murray was its chief funder and was chairman from 1928 to its disbandment in 1945. The International Institute was established by the French government and handed over to the League of Nations 1926. Its director was always a Frenchman, but its deputy director and guiding spirit was Alfred Zimmermann from 1926 to 1930. It also had a board of directors of 6 persons. Gilbert Murray was one of these from 1926. It is interesting to know that from 1931 to 1939 the Indian representative on the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation was Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. In 1931 he was George V. Professor of Philosophy at Calcutta University. His subsequent career is interesting. He was knighted in 1931, became Spalding Professor of Eastern Religions and Ethics at Oxford in 1936, and became a Fellow of All Souls in 1944. Beginning in 1928 at Berlin, Professor Zimmermann organized annual round-table discussion meetings under the auspices of the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. These were called the International Studies Conferences and devoted themselves to an effort to obtain different national points of view on international problems. The members of the studies conferences were 25 organizations. 20 of these were coordinating committees created for the purpose in 20 different countries. The other 5 were the following international organizations: the Academy of International Law at The Hague, the European Centre of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Geneva School of International Studies, the Graduate Institute of International Studies at Geneva, the Institute of Pacific Relations. Of these 5, the influence of the Milner Group and its close allies was preponderant. In addition, the influence of the group was decisive in the coordinating committees within the British Commonwealth, especially in the British Coordinating Committee for International Studies. The members of this committee were named by 4 agencies, 3 of which were controlled by the Milner Group. They were: 1. The RIIA, 2. The London School of Economics and Political Science, 3. The Department of International Politics at University College of Wales, Aberystwyth, and for a Montagu Burton Chair of International Relations at Oxford. We have already indicated that the Montagu Burton Chair was largely controlled by the Milner Group, since the group always had a preponderance on the board of electors to that chair. This was apparently not assured by the original structure of this board, and it was changed in the middle 1930s. After the change, the board had 7 electors: 1 the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford, ex officio; 2 the Master of Balliol, ex officio; 3 Viscount Cecil of Shelwood, for Gilbert Murray, for life; 5 B.H. Sumner, 6 Sir Arthur Salter, and 7 Sir J. Fisher Williams of New College. Thus, at least 4 of this board were members of the group. In 1947 the electoral board to a Montagu Burton professorship consisted of R. M. Barrington, ward editor of the Times; Miss Agnes Headlam Morley, daughter of Sir James Headlam Morley of the group; Sir Arthur Salter, RCK and Zor; and 1 vacancy, to be filled by Balliol College. It was this board, apparently, that named Miss Headlam Morley to the Montagu Burton professorship when A. L. Woodward resigned in 1947. As can be seen, the Milner Group influence was predominant, with only 1 member out of 5 and Zor clearly not of the group. The RIIA had the right to name 3 persons to the coordinating committee. 2 of these were usually of the Milner Group. In 1933, for example, the 3 were Lord Meston, Clement Jones, and Toynbee. The meetings of the International Studies Conferences were organized in a fashion identical with that used in other meetings controlled by the Milner Group. For example, in the unofficial conferences on British Commonwealth relations, and the proceedings were published by the Institute of Intellectual Cooperation in a similar way to those of the unofficial conferences just mentioned, except that the various speakers were identified by name. As examples of the work which the International Studies Conferences handled, we might mention that at the 4th and 5th sessions Copenhagen in 1931 and Milan in 1932 they examined the problem of the state and economic life; at the 7th and 8th session Paris in 1934 and London in 1935 they examined the problem of collective security; and at the 9th and 10th sessions Madrid in 1936 and Paris 1937 they examined the problem of university teaching of international relations. In all of these conferences the Milner Group played a certain part. They could have monopolized the British delegations at these meetings if they had wished, but, with typical Milner Group modesty, they made no effort to do so. Their influence appeared most clearly at the London meeting of 1935. 39 delegates from 14 countries assembled at Chatham House to discuss the problem of collective security. Great Britain had 10 delegates. They were Dr. Hugh Dalton, Professor H. Lauderput, Captain Liddell Hart, Lord Lytton, Professor A. D. McNair, Professor C. A. W. Manning, Dr. David Mitrany, Rear Admiral H. G. Fiercefield, Arnold J. Toynbee, and Professor C. K. Webster. In addition, The Geneva School of International Studies sent two delegates, J. H. Richardson and A. E. Zimmern. The British delegation presented three memoranda to the conference. The first, a study of sanctions, was prepared by the RIIA and has been published since. The second, a study of British opinion on collective security, was prepared by the British Coordinating Committee. The third, a collection of British views on collective security, was prepared by the delegates. It had an introduction by Meston and 9 articles, of which one was by G. M. Gawthorne Hardy and one by H. V. Hobson. Zimmern also presented the memorandum on behalf of the Geneva School. Opening speeches were made by Austin Chamberlain, Gallant W. Dulles of the Council on Foreign Relations and Louis Wiseman of the University of Paris. Closing speeches were made by Lord Meston, Gallant Dulles, and Gilbert Murray. Meston acted as president of the conference, and Dulles as chairman of the study meetings. The proceedings were edited and published by a committee of 2 Frenchmen and A. J. Toynbee. At the sessions on peaceful change in 1936–37, Australia presented one memorandum, the growth of Australian population. It was written by F. W. Eggleston and G. Packer. The United Kingdom presented 15 memoranda. 8 of these were prepared by the RIIA, and 7 by individuals. Of the 7 individual works, 2 were written by members of All Souls who were also members of the Milner Group, C. H. Macartney and C. R. M. F. Crutchwell. The other 5 were written by experts who were not members of the group: A. M. Carr Saunders, A. B. Keith, D. Harwood, H. Lauderput, and Art Kozinski. In the middle 1930s, the Milner Group began to take an interest in the problem of refugees and stateless persons, as a result of the persecutions of Hitler and the approaching closing of financing office of the League of Nations. Sir Neil Malcolm was made High Commissioner for German Refugees in 1936. The following year, the RIIA began the research program in the problem. This resulted in the massive report, edited by Sir John Hope Simpson, who was not a member of the group and was notoriously unsympathetic to Zionism. 1939. In 1938, Roger Makins was made secretary to the British delegation to the Evian Conference on Refugees. Mr. Makins' full career will be examined later. At this point it is merely necessary to note that he was educated at Winchester School and at Christ Church, Oxford, and was elected to a fellowship at All Souls in 1925, when only 21 years old. After the Evian Conference, where the British, for strategic reasons, left all the responsible positions to the Americans, Mr. Makins was made secretary to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. He was British Minister in Washington from 1945 to 1947 and is now Assistant Under Secretary in the Foreign Office. Before leaving the subject of refugees, we might mention that the chief British agent for Czechoslovakian refugees in 1938 to 1939 was R. J. Stopford, an associate of the Milner Group already mentioned. At the time of the Czechoslovak crisis in September 1938, the RIIA began to act in an unofficial fashion as an advisor to the Foreign Office. When war began a year later, this was made formal, and Chatham House became, for all practical purposes, the research section of the Foreign Office. A special organization was established in the Institute, in charge of A.J. Toynbee, with Lionel Curtis as his chief support, acting as the permanent representative of the chairman of the council, Lord Astor. The organization consisted of the press clipping collection, the information department, and much of the library. These were moved to Oxford and set up in Balliol, All Souls, and Rhodes House. The project was financed by the Treasury, All Souls, Balliol, and Chatham House jointly. Within a brief time, the organization became known as the Foreign Research and Press Service FRPs. It answered all questions on international affairs from government departments, prepared a weekly summary of the foreign press, and prepared special research projects. When Anthony Eden was asked a question in the House of Commons on July 23, 1941, regarding the expense of this project, he said that the Foreign Office had given it £53,000 in the fiscal year 1940–1941. During the winter of 1939–1940, the general meetings of the Institute were held in Rhodes House, Oxford, with Hugh Wyndham generally presiding. The periodical International Affairs suspended publication, but the Bulletin of International News continued, under the care of Hugh Latimer and A. J. Brown. The latter had been an undergraduate at Oxford in 1933–1936, was elected a Fellow of All Souls in 1938, and obtained a D.Phil. in 1939. The former Matey Alfred Hugh Latimer, who was an undergraduate at Merton from 1938 to 1946 and was elected to the foundation of the same college in 1946. As the work of the FRPs grew too heavy for Curtis to supervise alone, he was given a committee of 4 assistants. They were G. N. Clark, H. J. Peyton, C. K. Webster, and A. Easmern. About the same time, the London School of Economics established a quarterly journal devoted to the subject of post-war reconstruction. It was called Agenda, and G. N. Clark was editor. Clark had been a member of All Souls since 1912 and was Chucheley Professor of Economic History from 1931 to 1943. Since 1943 he has been Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge. Not a member of the Miltner Group, he is close to it and was a member of the Council of Chatham House during the recent war. At the end of 1942, the Foreign Secretary Eden wrote to Lord Astor that the government wished to take the FRPs over completely. This was done in April 1943. The existing Political Intelligence Department of the Foreign Office was merged with it to make the new Research Department of the Ministry. Of this new department, Toynbee was director and Zimmern deputy director. This brief sketch of the Royal Institute of International Affairs does not by any means indicate the very considerable influence which the organization exerts in English-speaking countries in the sphere to which it is devoted. The extent of that influence must be obvious. The purpose of this chapter has been something else: to show that the Milner Group controls the Institute. Once that is established, the picture changes. The influence of Chatham House appears in its true perspective, not as the influence of an autonomous body but as merely one of many instruments in the arsenal of another power. When the influence which the Institute wields is combined with that controlled by the Milner Group in other fields, in education, in administration, in newspapers and periodicals, a really terrifying picture begins to emerge. This picture is called terrifying not because the power of the Milner Group was used for evil ends. It was not. On the contrary, it was generally used with the best intentions in the world, even if those intentions were so idealistic as to be almost academic. The picture is terrifying because such power, whatever the goals at which it may be directed, is too much to be entrusted safely to any group. That it was too much to be safely entrusted to the Milner Group will appear quite clearly in Chapter 12. No country that values its safety should allow what the Milner Group accomplished in Britain, that is, that a small number of men should be able to wield such power in administration and politics, should be given almost complete control over the publication of the documents relating to their actions, should be able to exercise such influence over the avenues of information that create public opinion, and should be able to monopolize so completely the writing and the teaching of the history of their own period,